All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Julie Watkins, and I'll be helping with today's Travelogue, brought to you by the Geographic Society of Chicago. Since 1898, the Geographic Society of Chicago has educated the public about geography and its important uses. And today's GSC trains students in the latest geospatial technology. Through services such as our community mapping projects, we offer unique educational experiences that harness the power of maps and the integrative tools of GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, to solve environmental and community issues. Together, our board and membership provide educational opportunities for students and educators, assist in building geographic materials collections in educational and cultural institutions, promote new and emerging technologies and problem solving, and much more. If you're familiar with our Travelogue series, you know that normally we conduct these presentations in person each month at the Chicago Cultural Center. While we can't get together physically at the moment, the GSC wanted to remain connected with its members and supporters, so we've turned our Travelogue series into webinars, at least until we get back into a new state of normal. After this Travelogue, please make sure to share any feedback you have with us. With us to present today is Dr. Daniel Bloch, a former board member of the GSC. Daniel will be taking us back to this past winter as he worked, researched, and explored southern France. We'll also hear about the nationwide strike in France and his race back to the US with the onset of COVID-19. Before we begin, let me note that we will have a Q&A session following Daniel's presentation. If you look at your screen, you'll see the Q&A button down at the bottom. And if there's any question that you have for Daniel, go ahead and type it into that chat window. Following the presentation, we will answer as many questions as time allows. With that, I will pass things over to Daniel for today's presentation, and thank you for being here, everybody.
Thanks, Julie, and thank you for everybody who is here. I so much more wish that we could do this in person and be in the beautiful Cultural Center, which is truly one of my favorite buildings in the world, and I hope that we soon will all be back listening and interacting over travelogues at the Cultural Center and going out and exploring the world in general. So I am going to talk today about my past, basically how I spent my winter. Looking at street food and sort of experiencing and exploring southern France. I was on sabbatical the last year, from August 2019 through May of 2020, and I've been a professor at Chicago State University on the South Side since 1999, but because of various appointments that I had at Chicago State, as well as the fact that for a while Chicago State wasn't allowing sabbaticals because of some financial issues we had, this is my first sabbatical in 13 years. And during that first sabbatical, I was involved in a big project looking at food access, food deserts, you may say, in Chicago. And I also had young kids, and during that time, I basically never left Chicago. And so one of the things I really wanted to do on the sabbatical is to go abroad. And at first, I hoped to take my whole family. But because of various reasons, number one, that my kids are now at an age that they have a lot of say in they have a lot of opinions on what they want to do. We actually wound up not being able to go as a family. But my wife, Marta, and I encouraged me still to take the chance that I had to spend some time doing research in France, as I'd already been supported through a small grant at the University of Montpellier. And I had teamed up with a group of folks, mainly French folks, but also an anthropologist here at Roosevelt University, to compare the regulation of street food in Chicago, Hanoi, Bangkok, and Montpellier. And we have partners in Hanoi and Bangkok, and at least as far as I know at this point, not going to go there, but I spent the winter studying in Montpellier, France, in the south of France, and looking at the history of the regulation of street food. So I went out and experienced street food culture there, but I also spent a lot of time in archives, reading French materials in manuscript form, trying to make them out because my French isn't all that great, and just experiencing the life of being a scholar and working at a research institution in France. So let me tell you a little bit about Montpellier, and then I'll tell you just a little bit about the work I did, and then share with you quite a bit about southern France in general and my experiences. So Montpellier is a city of about 280,000, the seventh largest city in France. It's in the historic region of Languedoc. And, you know, I've always thought of Languedoc as sort of the part of the Mediterranean France that is not Provence. So it is west of the Rhone, and is now is the capital of the department of Hérault in the region of, and I always say this wrong, but Occitanie, which is sort of the new kind of system of regions that has come to France in the last 6 years or so. It's about 10 kilometers from the Mediterranean, and it's a university city. It's actually has one of the youngest populations in France, lots and lots of students around. The university was actually founded as a medical school. I believe it's the second oldest medical school in Europe, maybe even in the world. It has a medieval core. So a lot of the cities around Montpellier, like Nimes, which I'll talk about, and Narbonne, were Roman cities originally. Montpellier was a medieval city founded in about 900. Built up, really, it sort of reached its kind of early growth in like the 13th century. And then I worked at INRA, the National Agricultural Research Center. And the INRA, which used to be called INRA, is the agricultural research center devoted to the study of agriculture in France. So what was important about that for me is that the vast majority of the people working in INRA are French, or else sometimes folks from former French colonies. As far as I know, is the only American on campus. So while Montpellier actually has a good number of Americans living there, or especially living around the area. It's southern France. A lot of people retire to southern France from the United States, as well as places like Germany, Holland, and England. I really had a pretty French experience. So my colleagues were French. I lived with in a house with a French roommate. So that was actually quite fun for me, and helped, I hope at least, me learn French. Hérault itself is a beautiful place. It feels to me, at least in terms of the landscape, a little like maybe the area around Santa Barbara. Perhaps a little bit wetter than that, and not quite as warm, but it is on the Mediterranean, and there's sort of a flat, rolling hills kind of area near the Mediterranean, and then a mountain, a set of mountains called the Cevennes, which make up kind of the area away from the Mediterranean. and are quite beautiful. They top off at about 5,000, 6,000 feet. They're not, it's, which I think maybe a little bit lower than that. It would be, if folks know the Massif Central, which is to the north of here, it's kind of an outgrowth of the Massif Central, but it's very beautiful. Looks in, from a geographic standpoint, the climate is generally Mediterranean, very hot summers, which is when many more people are here coming to especially on the seashore. Wet and cool winters, but apparently, there hasn't been any snow for about 5 or 6 years. It certainly was a nice place for me to pass the winter, but it definitely was a winter. So I'd say it got down to its coolest. Maybe there was a high in the 40s and a low in the high 30s, but it never froze. So I was supposed to go for 4 full months. As you see, there's a little bit of squeezing on both sides. On the one side, I had trouble getting a long-term visa, which I had to do because I was going for 4 months rather than 3 months, which is the limit to how long you can be there for a tourist visa. And fortunately, there was a bunch of stuff I didn't know. First of all, my passport was expiring less than 6 months after I got back, so I had to have a new passport. By the time I got the new passport, I just had 6 weeks to get the visa. France visas, now there's sort of a subcontractor. You can't actually go to the consulate here to get your visa, even if you're like a scientific talent, which is what I was under my long-term visa that I was applying for. So I paid the money, did everything to do this long-term visa, got health insurance, all this stuff, and then it didn't arrive. And finally, I had to cancel my visa request, get my passport back so I could just go to France on my passport. The nice thing about that was that because of that, I had to delay my departure for a week. And it was good that that the government of France was actually paying for my ticket. But because I had to delay my departure for a week, I got to have Thanksgiving with my family in Ohio. So I drove, I think on Wednesday before Thanksgiving to Ohio. I had Thanksgiving dinner the next day, and Friday morning I flew to Chicago, had lunch in my favorite diner in Oak Park, and then took off for Paris the next day. Took off for Paris Friday night, arrived Saturday morning, and switched to a plane to, I think I spent the day in Paris and switched to a plane to Montpellier, where I arrived. So I arrived maybe about, 30 hours after I left Columbus. So a very long trip to get there, and 2 days later I had a Publix presentation. So I was a rather tired guy, especially after giving that presentation. However, overall, it was a beautiful and nice place to spend a sabbatical. Here, just pictures of the campus where I was on. The research campus had been what they call a plantation, or there was an old kind of chateau that had been given to the government and fields around it that had been given to the government to create an agricultural research station. Beyond the palm trees there, you can see rows of grapevines. And there's just a picture of the lunch. I'm not sure if this is true at every French canteen, but the lunches there were pretty incredible, usually from local produce, because it was local meat as well, and fish, all prepared in a I guess what French folks might not say is kind of haute cuisine style, but I thought it was pretty amazing. I lived at 32 Rue Luneray in Montpellier in an area called the Beziers, which was just north of the center of the city, in a room that I rented from the man you see here, Vincent, who somehow I never got a picture of my roommate's front side, just his backside. But it was actually a rather an area of Montpellier, because it was right next to the center. It was kind of I guess they would call maybe a gentrified area. But it had been where the city slaughterhouses were, as well as houses like the one I was in, which was actually created for a family that pressed wine. So that's why there was this large garage space here. And within the house, there was still an old wine pressing sort of store, what we now use as a storage space. And then the family would live above in what would have been here, well, French would call the first floor. And then up in the attic, Vincent had, when he lived with his family here, had built on a series of bedrooms. And I actually lived in the one that's behind the shutters. For 400 euros a month, which was a wonderful and cheap price. Vincent was a great guy. And the neighborhood had a daily produce market in the middle of the square. That would be there every morning, except I think on Sundays. And then it would be packed up, and everybody and the cafes that surrounded the square would put out benches or put out tables and chairs, and folks would hang out at the cafes and have wonderful food. It was truly just a great place to pass what turned out to be 3.5 months. And Vincent, because I stayed with him, I got to really, and because he was a nice guy, I got to connect in with the sort of local society in Montpellier and meet lots of folks which I never would have met, and learn about different things in France that I would have never learned about before. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on. So I arrived on, as I said, Saturday night in France. And I knew that I was going to be getting a stipend of 3,900 euros from the French government, actually through the University of Montpellier. That was the Muse program, which was supposed to last me a month, but I wanted to stay for 4 months. And that's actually not that much money for 4 months. But as I said, I was only paying $400 a month, or 400 euros a month for my room. So I really tried to be cheap about everything else, and I made it last about 3 months. But to get it, the way that Campus France, who deals with French or non-French nationals in France who are students or researchers, to get my stipend, Campus France said I had to go to a particular currency exchange in the railroad station on a Saturday. It was Saturday the next week after I came, and give my name. And I thought they were going to give me some sort of debit card. Instead, they gave me 3,900 euros in cash, which I then had to transport across the center of the city back to my house on foot. I only had, I thought I was going to get a bike, but I wanted to just walking everywhere. And you know about European cities, and Montpellier isn't different. One of the crime is very low, except pickpocketing. And I had been warned all about pickpocketing in that first week. And here I had 3,900 euros, and which was supposed to last me the whole time. And first thing I did is that it was was to think, well, maybe I should go to the bank. And then it turns out I looked into this, and it's just hard for foreign nationals who are not going to be in France longer than 6 months or so and have a permanent job in France to get a bank account, especially with cash. Like they thought, well, where'd you get all that cash? So I wound up walking across Montpellier with all this cash, kind of huddling in my coat, and then basically living off of a stash of cash I had in my bedroom the rest of the time. So that was a little weird for me. And this is what I was walking across during the day. But I came into Montpellier having only really been to Paris and France, and Paris is beautiful. It was Christmas time, or the Christmas lights were already up. And this is the central square of Montpellier, Comedy. Called Comedy because the opera house you see at the end that's not the end with the Ferris wheel, has a big sign at the top that says, I think, drama, comedy, teatro, opera, something like that. Anyway, it's a beautiful space, and also fills up with cafes, and is just a gorgeous place to be. Built during the late 19th century, sort of where Montpellier and others kind of regional cities of France were trying to copy the success of the Haussmann era in Paris and building boulevards and tearing down the old city. Fortunately, not that much of that happened in Montpellier, and still most of the medieval core is still there. Montpellier, as I said, is about 10 miles from the Mediterranean. And you see along the Mediterranean there's an offshore barrier island and then lagoons called étangs. And actually, on my first full day in France, my host at INRA, a guy named Christophe Soulard, great guy, took me and a colleague to the beach to see the étang and the wildlife there. And while much of the beach area in this part of France is highly developed with lots of condos and such, this area was not, and this is just gorgeous. Lots of birds, lots of pelicans, flamingos, and as you can see in the picture on the lower left, and just a gorgeous place. There's also a mostly ruined cathedral called Magdalene, and this island that it is on was actually the main settlement in the area during the early medieval period, and the cathedral was a place of pilgrimage for folks over a large area. Today it's mainly ruined, but it's surrounded by a vineyard and a garden that is run by INRA along the Mediterranean, so you see this picture of the vineyard with the étang and the Mediterranean in the back. Just a beautiful agricultural landscape. Unfortunately for me, just a few days after I came, the general strike that you may have heard about, that it's one of the longest and most sort of intense general strikes in French history, started. And this was really interesting to me. There was basically the strike in Montpellier. There were strike days. Montpellier wasn't like Paris, where certain things like the metro just weren't running at all. But on strike days, nothing would run. There were marches, which I they were kind of marches of the bureaucrats. It felt like that to me. My colleagues would march. Anybody working for any government-oriented agency at all would march. And well, it generally was fairly placid, fairly loud, but not, there's no violence or anything. But occasionally there were smoke bombs, other things like that. So it can get a little worrisome at times. In Paris, it was very, very different. So I visited Paris with my family over Christmas, and you just couldn't get anywhere. It was just a mess. For me, what it really did is that on my weekends, so I basically was working during the week, and on my weekends, it meant I pretty much had to stay pretty close to home. There were a few trains running, but it was kind of not predictable. The buses were running, so I went to things during December and into part of January that I could get to easily. And it also meant that at my institution, like, there were meetings about the strike and about what we were going to do. And even after January, there were strike days. So, and people were complaining about the neoliberalization of the university and the focus on getting grants and the same kinds of things that faculty in Chicago and elsewhere in the United States complain about. But yet they were getting together and organizing in a way that I hadn't seen other than for salaries in the US. So it was really an interesting case. I said I got to do a lot of things that others, if I hadn't stayed with Vincent, I wouldn't have gotten to do. He was really into rugby. He took me to a Montpellier rugby game. Southern France is really into rugby. It's actually, at least in my experience, more than soccer, especially Languedoc. So rugby was kind of there is a French soccer team from Montpellier, but rugby seemed to be more the focus. I got Vincent was part of a cooperative that owned an olive farm, so I got to go out and pick olives, which I did with sort of a rake. And you see, I actually picked quite a few, and not all of those, but I was pretty productive. I got to go on just a beautiful hike in the Savannah. These kinds of things that, because you needed a car to get there, I would never have done. We hiked to the top of the mountain you see there. Through landscape that was kind of California-like, Southern California-like. And nearby there was this beautiful chateau, but really struck me. So I woke up that morning, I had no idea we were going for a hike. He said, "You want to go for a hike?" I said, yes. And he said, "Well, you've got to bring some food." And in my mind, I was like, granola bar, like hike. That's what I think of as hiking food. And everybody, like, people brought avocados, hard-boiled eggs. Fortunately, the day before, I had gone shopping to the butcher shop, and I had a salami, and I had some cheese, and I brought that, and I think I might have had a baguette too. Anyway, so I was in. But this was the most beautiful picnic I had ever seen, and just to eat so well while hiking just seemed to me, again, sort of a French thing. I also was lucky enough to have a friend of a friend, an American who had retired to Nimes, which is a small town, really a village, outside of Penzenas, which is kind of a somewhat famous tourist town in Hérault. And she, it turned out, was one of many, many folks who retired to the area and usually to small villages. And that was kind of cool for me to see too, because I had no idea that experience was out there, because I was hanging out with French people, because I was living in Montpellier, which is the city, and most of these folks were out in more in the rural areas. So I stayed with her in Nimes for a weekend and was able to see some of the countryside of Hérault, chateaus and more mountains, and as well as vineyards and a beautiful rainbow. The city square lit up. It's a beautiful place. Nîmes, if I would say everybody who can should go to Nîmes if you're ever in southern France. It's the capital of Gard, which is the next department to the east of Hérault. It's a Roman town, famous for its cathedral as well as this Roman temple called the Maison Carrée. I thought this was just a very French thing. It's sort of, the Maison Carrée is kind of in the middle of the square, in the middle of Nîmes, where they had put a skating rink, so because it was Christmas time. So here we have the skating rink next to this 2nd century Roman temple, which is one of the best preserved Roman temples in the world. I'm sorry. And then there's also this tower, which was part of the Roman wall around Nîmes. But what I thought was just beautiful is that Nîmes also has one of the first public parks that was put there during the time of, actually it was after during the 18th century by a local noble and for the public of Nîmes. Nîmes was founded around a sort of sacred spring, and there's a Roman, I sort of missed it when I was there, but there's a temple to Diana around this sacred spring. And then there's these pools of water going down through these gardens. They're just gorgeous. So I encourage you all to go there if you ever get a chance. My family came in and we went to London and Paris over Christmas break. My son Joey, my daughter Madeline, my wife Marta. My son really wanted to go to a English football game, so we did. His team is West Ham. And then we got to have New Year's Eve with, I have some relatives in Paris, and we got to have New Year's Eve and see the Eiffel Tower at New Year's at the beginning of 2020, hoping for a wonderful year. So it's turned out as it be a rather odd year. After that, I left my family off at Charles de Gaulle Airport and just tried to figure out what I could do because most of the trains were down. And there was a train going towards Switzerland, and I decided I would just go to Switzerland because I needed, even though I wanted to tour around France, I couldn't be sure of having a train. So I went to Zurich, I went up in the Alps, had a wonderful time. And then arrived back to Montpellier and really started kind of a general daily pattern of going. I did most of my work at the archives, looking at old French documents, going swimming at this beautiful Olympic-sized pool that was right by the archives, eating lunch often from street food vendors. This is at, in the news section, this is all actually the archives, the swimming pool, and this market is all at the news section of Montpellier called Antigone. And then coming back home and often getting pizza from Chez Vincent, which is actually, I don't know, I can never figure out if it was called Chez Vincent because of this, but Vincent, my roommate, was actually grew up in that building and lived around the corner from it. So I think it might have been. I also joined Kahila Kadem, which is a synagogue there in Montpellier. And sort of went into the life of, I guess, in the way of an expat, but doing experiencing the city on a day-to-day basis, and had a really, really nice time. Interestingly, I was studying street food, but when things called street, when I talk about street food, people from Montpellier, they thought I was talking about something American. But street food was an American thing that focused on food trucks and was brought over to France and then popularized. So this is actually a new kind of development here called Marché de l'Aise that advertised that it had street food from around the world, called street food in English. It had food trucks that were just permanently there, were really made to be driven or anything. So it was funny because I came to study the street food life in France, and which turned out really to be more about markets than about, there really weren't too many just sort of vendors on the street, at least in the winter. There's some things like a few tents that were attached to permanent restaurants, and a few in the middle of the city. But a lot of it was about outdoor markets, rather than, and then outdoor markets and bakeries, boulangeries, which would be selling sandwiches and stuff in the style that in addition to baguettes. I took a little trip to Utrecht, the Netherlands, where I actually had lived for a year when I was about 18, which was a lot of fun. I got to, fortunately, this building there, the building that I had all my classes in when I was 18, is now closed and going to be torn down, but there's asbestos in it, so they're not sure what to do with it. That is what you can get to eat at the canteen in Holland, which is similarly nice looking, much better than what we can get at Chicago State, and I presented a paper there. Once I got back from Utrecht, in February started, people started thinking about, talking about COVID more and more, even though it had not come to, well, it only had come to Europe on a real minor way. So I started thinking, all right, I don't have that much time left. I'm not sure when I'll have to go home. I was only 3 hours away from Barcelona. Finally, the trains are running. I went down to Barcelona, spent a wonderful weekend, both doing the things like looking at Gaudi, people do in Barcelona, but I also tried to experience some of the local life. So I just walked and went to a just local soccer game of two clubs. Everybody was kind of looking at me, wondering why I was there. It was basically like going to a Little League game, and stopping by places that just had Spanish tortillas and stuff. But I had a great time there. And then basically it was almost, in a race the rest of the time to get my research done and see part of the area, more of the area than I had, because my first month and a half had been difficult because of the strike. So right near Montpellier on the Mediterranean is the city of Sete, which is another beautiful place. It is kind of, I don't know, looks a little like Monterey in a sense, because it's got a large mountain overlooking the ocean. But it's also very gritty. It's an old harbor, old fishing harbor, and is known for this tierra pufa, an octopus-filled tart, that it was originally came from Italy, and actually I read it came from Spain originally via Italy to Sete. But these are the very long steps up the mountain, and this is the view going down the mountain. And I mean, the view from the top of the mountain is just gorgeous, 360 view all around. And this is the harbor of Sete, which is where the Canal de Midi, which I'll talk about it, which connects Toulouse and ultimately the Atlantic with the Mediterranean exits. Built in the time of Louis XIV, it was thought of as one of the great wonders of the world at that time. And you can see the mountain behind. I also went to Carcassonne. Carcassonne is actually the second most popular destination in France after Paris. One thing you'll note in these pictures is there's nobody there. This was when, sort of starting late February, there were no outside, like tourists from outside France really in France. I was there with, I mean, it wasn't totally empty, but it's known for just being a place to avoid in the summer. It is a ancient citadel city surrounded by walls that were built up in the, rebuilt in the 19th century to sort of be kind of a romantically, what the French thought of as a romantic French citadel town. So the walls are actually, it was a ruin at that time. There weren't things like, these tops of the, shouldn't have been pointed. The arrow slits here shouldn't have been there. There's all sorts of issues, but it's really, really cool looking. And the town itself is actually old. The cathedral is real. It's real, but kind of made up. The next week, so March 8th, 2020, I was supposed to meet up with my friend from Nimes to say goodbye because I was supposed to be leaving on March 21st. She was sick. I was going to meet her in Beziers. At that time, there was a report in about, I think, 20 people who had COVID in Arrow and none in Beziers. So I thought, well, I'll go to Beziers anyway because I wanted to see it. Beziers is another city in Arrow. It's known for being a sort of center of bullfighting. Even though Hemingway was in Spain mainly, I kind of think of Hemingway going around there. But it is also a citadel over, this is the Orbe River. And this is a beautiful public park. Well, almost nobody was. Almost nobody was around anywhere in the town. And this was on a weekend. I believe it's actually, I'd say March 8th, but I'm thinking it was a Saturday, so it probably would have been March 7th. It is right next to it. The other big thing to do there is the locks on the Canal de Midi. There's, I think, 7 layers of locks here going over. It's sort of the greatest number of rocks anywhere on this canal that was built, again, under Louis XIV. And the canal crosses the Orbe River. So here you can see the canal being over the river itself on a bridge. It's really an impressive place, beautiful place. And there was just a few people around. Everybody, like we were all just, I don't know how it felt here, but everybody was not sure what to do. We were told to, basically try to avoid people. I was generally trying to avoid public transportation, but there were still some things I wanted to do. So I had some final walks around Montpellier, including to this ice cream place that said it was going to open on March 1st. I wanted to get in before it closed. Montpellier has a beautiful aqueduct that was built in the 18th century to look like the Pont de Garde, which is the famous aqueduct in Gard near Nimes that I didn't get to because I had to wind up leaving early. Looking at some more markets in Montpellier. Presenting, I did a final presentation. Also, Philippe Duc I was working with. She interned, did a presentation herself, saying goodbye to my colleagues who are just wonderful folks. All this on March 10th. March 11th, I believe, I changed my ticket to leave on March 14th out of Paris. Or sorry, I was supposed to be leaving on March 21st. I was really lucky because that evening Trump announced what we thought was first announced that after March 13th, nobody would be allowed back in the country. Turns out Americans would be allowed back in, but we didn't know that at the time. I left Montpellier on March 13th. Really just, I was, at that point, I was gonna spend the rest of that week, that last week, I'd finished everything. I was gonna be going to Provence, spend some time in Paris. Instead, I left, flew to the Paris airport. I spent the night in the Paris airport at the airport hotel, right in the middle of the airport. I looked out my window and there was an ambulance coming to a plane, and it was just weird. It was nobody seemed to be around, and yet some people were actually just stuck at that airport hotel and not sure where they could go or when. I met a guy from New Zealand who wasn't sure if he'd ever get home. I then flew to London, where at Heathrow, nothing, like in France, everything was closing up. The night before night before I left, that was my night of March 12th, Macron had talked to the citizens of France saying we're going to close everything up after Monday, I think. So basically after I left, everything closed. But it was already really closing. Really not true in London. Although people were trying to stay away from each other, it just wasn't the case that things were closing. I flew to business class to Chicago, and then I was in, you may have heard of the horrible line. It took me 6 hours to get through security. And then I sat in an area for extra checking because I have asthma and I had a low shortness of breath. And there were people coughing all around me. It was really horrible. Everybody had switched, or many people had switched their tickets to that day. And O'Hare just wasn't, they didn't have enough people. They didn't know what they were doing. The security folks were saying, we don't know what we're doing. It was a problem. And somehow through all that, and standing next to all these people from all different parts of Europe, Italy, Spain, places where it was just blooming at that time, I didn't get COVID. And I got back home. And thank you. And I'd love to answer any questions that are out there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniel. That was fantastic. So we have some questions from our audience here, and I want to encourage anybody else with a lingering question to go ahead and just put it in the Q&A box down at the bottom. There's a button that says Q&A. But we'll go ahead and start asking questions. If you want to stop sharing your screen. Here we go. All right.
Everybody.
As you traveled to other countries, did you experience any difficulty with communicating in the different languages?
So, first of all, I certainly experienced difficulty communicating in French. I had been taking French for about almost a year. But, taking French to a 1 day a week class and online and such is not like doing the immersion that I did. So I did a week-long deep immersion class while I was there, and then had a tutor, but it still was tough. By the end of the time, though, I was able to generally get around, order food, hold a sort of easy conversation, go into stores and pretty much order whatever I wanted. But in groups, like what I really wanted is for my colleagues in meetings, and I was in a research group, not to have to speak English. And at the end, I actually came close to that. So basically, they would speak in French, and my questions were generally in English, and they'd answer in French. And I'm still taking French. I thought of it as one of the, it's been a sort of lifetime goal for me to learn French. I do speak fairly fluent Dutch. So unfortunately, that's not generally as useful in the world, but it was really great for me when I went to Holland to be able to speak Dutch. And the thing about Dutch was everybody kind of assumes if you're American to start speaking English. So, and my presentation had to be in English because the university I was at was University of Utrecht is now bilingual, or now mainly English speaking actually for everybody. So I had the most issues in Barcelona because I really don't speak Spanish or Catalan. And in Zurich, I have a little German, but just a little. So that, but it what I found was learning French helped me remember my Dutch, and learning Dutch helped me remember my German. And I had a tiny bit of Spanish. Learning French maybe helped me with that too. So, and Catalan, it was just cool to hear. I don't know, but it was fun. I really, it was one of my main things that I wanted to experience.
Cool, thank you. So my French is not awesome, so excuse me if I butcher this, but someone asks, did the Tia la Pouf sound or taste as good as it sounds?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. It is pretty greasy. I like greasy food, so I mean, I was into it. But it's got octopus, it's got a whole bunch of different vegetables. It's so it was really good. But for I guess in a way for a kind of healthy American diet, it was kind of greasy. So so I guess I maybe not quite as good as I imagined because it was greasier than I thought. But I like meat pies and such too. So I think I really encourage, I don't know how many folks have spent time in this area, but if you're in Sete, don't leave without having a tiel. But expect it to be just a little bit greasy.
Here's another food question. Does the food in southern France differ from typical food in the rest of France?
Oh yeah, for sure. So I think like the food is based. I guess a lot of it is probably fairly similar to the food of Provence, but so a lot of olives, a lot of stews, a lot of things like ratatouille. But with the Spanish kind of influence, and I was struck in general by the Spanish influence in the area. There was a lot of Spanish people living in Montpellier, but it had there were times where the Knights of Aragon actually controlled Montpellier. I think they were kind of kicked out by the Knights of Toulouse. And even the Knights of Toulouse, or the Dukes of Toulouse, I think it was, had a lot of connections across the Pyrenees to Spain. And just south of Montpellier, in Roussillon, this most southern area of France, there's a very strong Catalan influence. It's about 500,000 Catalans living in Occitan. So, so I would say similar to Provence, but you know, a lot of fish, a lot of stews. I was there in the winter, so maybe a few more stews than normal. A lot of olives, tomatoes, that kind of Mediterranean food. But where Provence is next to Italy, Occitanie is next to Spain, and I think that makes a difference.
Another food question. What was your favorite street food in France?
Truly, sandwiches and other stuff I can get at the boulangerie. And this is, I would say, you know, I didn't have much money. I really tried to live on my budget that I was given for my daily food. So, and truly one of the cheapest ways to eat in France in general is going to the boulangerie and getting a sandwich on a baguette. So, you know, either the typical like Parisian sandwich, ham and cheese and butter. Sometimes you can get it with vegetables, you can get it with meats. You can also get a quiche. I mean, that's the fast food of France. I mean, other than there is also French locations of McDonald's, and there are these things called French tacos that are not at all like tacos, you know. But the boulangerie was truly the most useful place, and unfortunately, we found it. I don't know, maybe halfway in, because I was just getting my baguettes there and pastries. But for maybe €3.5, €4, up to €5, you could get a really nice bag lunch that I would take to the archives on days I was at the archives and eat out in the plaza outside the archives. So that was my favorites.
Awesome. What street food in Montpellier would you appreciate having here in Chicago? Was there much street food that it's common to both places?
Well, here in Oak Park, we do have a French street food cafe, which has these kind of sandwiches priced at a much higher price. They taste about the same. It's pretty good. Leia, I'll put a shout out for it. What I missed in France, I mean, whenever I'm in Europe, I miss Mexican food the most, truly. The Mexican, the kind of taquerias that we have here, there just isn't that. I have not had that in France. But they have things called French tacos that are usually are in a pita, and like they're just all sorts of odd, interesting, but certainly not Mexican ingredients. And there's Mexican restaurants, but it's not street food there. So I missed that when I was there. It's same thing when I was the other time I spent a long time in Europe when I was in Holland. There's a few more tacos in Holland now, but still Mexican food's so much better here. And what I just said about the boulangerie and I think it's somewhat because there's government-supported bread there, and you can get a baguette for €1. So then the baguette sandwiches are cheaper. But that if we had bakeries on every third block that were serving out, yummy sandwiches on, on French bread. That would be great.
So we have a few questions here about face masks and that big line that you encountered. So here is our first one. What a line that was. Was there a general sense of panic in that line, or was it relatively calm? And I'll ask the next one after you have answered that.
So I'd say it was relatively calm. I think I was on one of the first planes to arrive from Europe that day. So the line was sort of just forming when I got in. But it still was extremely long. I mean, it wasn't on the first flight. I was surrounded, it turned out, by American students who had been forced back from their study abroad programs from Spain. And it kind of freaked me out because at that time, Spain was one of the epicenters. I mean, it was moving to France, but this was a flight from Madrid, and things were really, really bad in Madrid right then. And these were students, and they had been out, you know, and I had been trying to balance socially distancing with seeing some things I wanted to see, but in Montpellier, I had really been trying to walk everywhere and not use public transport the last few days and not go to the most crowded places. But you know, nobody had masks, because that wasn't, well, nobody, maybe 1 out of every 20 people had masks. Basically nobody had masks. And it was me and a whole bunch of college students. It was really weird, but everybody generally was very calm. The worst thing though was there was a big long line. You got through it, and then you went into a longer line. The first line was for customs, and you didn't actually realize that the longer line of it was for the medical triaging that they did. They took everybody's temperature and gave you a form. So all of that took, I don't know, 4 to 5 hours. And then because I had some asthma, I said that, and I got into this area where we did get masks, where sick folks were, and where people who said things like I had asthma. And I was almost, and my only symptom was asthma. So, and I'm asthmatic, so it was stressful. So I figured that was what it was for. But I actually met with CDC epidemiologists, but they weren't doing any tests then because they just didn't have any testing stuff. And they took, the temperature of everybody. But, I was sitting with folks who are actually sick and who are still allowed into the country after chatting with the epidemiologists. The person next to me had a head cold, but was talking about how she had just come from a ski resort in Switzerland, and it just was, and had this head cold, was coughing all the time. I think she actually had a head cold that wasn't COVID. But I was almost certain that I would have gotten it in that situation, and I'm sure that day there was lots of COVID spreading. I just was lucky enough not to get it.
Yeah, wow. Our next questions go into your stipend. So you said it was supposed to last you a month, and you stretched it to about 4 months. Was your stipend typical for an American going to study in France or research in France?
I think the 3,900 for a month is actually pretty good, 130 euros a day. If you're staying at a hotel, I guess it cuts it a bit. But I don't know if it's typical, but it certainly wasn't a lot for the amount of time I tried to stretch it for. I missed the deadline for a Fulbright. I now actually am on this Fulbright list, so maybe I can go back. Sort of, there are these like short-term Fulbrights that would have applied to this. And Fulbrights are better paid and more organized and such. So this was sort of it was a program that the University of Montpellier had received a grant from the National Research Foundation of France to get scholars to come to France. So they paid, in addition to that $3,900, they also paid my way there and back, which turned out to be pretty expensive. So I'd say that's probably typical for a month, but you know, spreading it out over 3 or 4 months, that would be pretty low.
Yeah. Were the locks of the Canal du Midi solely for the control of water flow? And was there any boat traffic on that part of the river?
Yeah, so one, it's not a river. It's, you know, the whole thing is a canal. It was sometimes goes along a river for a while, but it was built newly built as a canal, and you can still do cruises, or you know, you can rent boats and go along the Canal du Midi. It's a thing many tourists do, actually, and you can, you know, there's even sort of a tourist kind of, people can arrange a boat and a guide and places to stay along the way. And in terms of those locks, though, they tried to build another option for the locks around it, and I think it didn't work. So I think that people, trying to remember if you still go down those particular locks or go around them. I didn't see anybody going down. I feel like there's a new set of locks around it, but I'm having trouble remembering. But definitely you can arrange a boat tour to go all the way from Toulouse to Sete if you want.
Our next question is, our family hosted a student from Montpellier. His family lives in a house of architectural interest made of green tarps at the base of a castle in Montpellier. His father is Ami Barak, an international curator. Did you happen to see this house in Montpellier?
I don't think it's a castle. Trying to think of what that would be. Maybe, I don't think I did. It doesn't ring a bell. Montpellier is surrounded by a series of what they call follies. A big chateau that people built, wealthy people of Montpellier built during mainly the 18th century and into the 19th. Thinking that might be the castle. I'd love to know where it is, and I could see if I've seen it. Because I was on foot, I only visited 1 or 2 of those chateaux. So the answer is no, but I'm very interested now in what that is.
And this is our last question. Is there an aggressive approach to preserving antiquities and sites in Spain? Is it common to find places like the Maguelone Cathedral ruins?
So Maguelone Cathedral and mainly Montpellier was in France, even though I went to Spain as well. But today the French are very, I I'd say very focused on preserving sites. And certainly the Montpellier Cathedral was thought of as a site very much worthy of preservation. There was preservation going on at the time that I was there, and they were raising money for it for the future. I think what is thought of as historically significant is because there's so many old things in France is kind of older than what we might think of is historically significant. You know, and they also, like, you know, in the 19th century, there was that rebuilding of the walls of Carcassonne in a totally not historic kind of way. So, I mean, I think the French kind of realized that that was an issue, but then, you know, I'm not sure, but I don't think if there was anything, you know, quite as historic as the Maison Carrée, the one in Nimes, the Roman temple of Nimes, we wouldn't have like an ice skating rink backed up right on it in America. Like our old things, there's just so few things of that sort. Although I think 50 years ago we might have, or maybe even less. Maybe I'm wrong. So I think there is active historical preservation, but it also, I don't know, it just seems a bit different. Like in the Colosseum in Nimes, they still do bullfighting. They, you know, they still, it's one of the better preserved Colosseums in the world, you know, in Southern Europe, including Italy. And yet it's still being used. And I like that. I mean, I like that about that they'll still use these historic landmarks like that. But it's also for Americans, I think, at least for me, it came off as a little odd given how old and how historic this actually was. So it feels to me like the French will do things in historic places that Americans, that might surprise Americans, and yet, you know, certainly it would be a crime to take off with part of that cathedral.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. And I think that will conclude our Travelogue presentation for today. So thank you so much to everybody for attending and for supporting the work of the Geographic Society of Chicago. Our next Travelogue will be at the end of October, featuring Cynthia Oberek as our presenter. For information on future Travelogues or on how to become a member of the GSC, please visit our website at www.geographicsociety.org. Thanks again, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, everybody.